Yeah, thank you to everyone for joining again in what is our third and penultimate episode in this AI for BI Masterclass series. Housekeeping stuff as usual. We are recording this, so we will send this out with any additional assets afterwards for you to share around your teams. As always, all of these sessions are available up on our Metric Insights YouTube channel. Lines are muted, but we will take Q&A and feel free to chat in the Q&A and chat windows. We'll come around to those near the end of the session today. But with that, welcome Marius again. Hi, Marius.
Hello, Mike. Thank you for the intro.
And
Thanks everyone for joining.
yeah, with that, let's pass it over to you, Marius.
All right. Well, let's get into it. So, just to review for a moment where we've come from and where we're going, so everyone has context. We have the four series masterclass. We covered originally the 10 fastest ways for people fail, most common failure modes. Then a few weeks ago, we talked about how to select the right tool and technology, various criteria, looking at the overall technology stack. If you didn't see those, welcome to. We encourage you to go check them out on YouTube. Today, we're going to focus on looking at the implementation playbook and really focusing on the areas that really need to be addressed as you build out a project plan for your AI for BI initiative. And then finally, kind of in a few weeks, we're going to, on 26th of March, we're going to pull together all the pieces and show you how everything works in practice. Have a whole bunch of examples, working integrations and so forth. And I think that's going to be really, really exciting to kind of take all the theory, everything we've covered, and actually see it in practice. So definitely encourage you to come for that. So with that, let's jump into talking about the implementation playbook. And let's frame that by looking at the different pillars that you need to make sure you have addressed in your project plan. So these are not so much tasks as just things that you want to be able to look at your plan and say, do I have this in here? Have I included these pieces? Because individual project plans may vary from different organizations, but if you don't have these elements in your AI for BI project plan, you're missing some key components. So we're going to look at how do you make sure that you understand and document your high value use cases. What's the right approach to look at defining your enterprise context landscape? All the things that are required to be able to address those use cases. Then, what are the approach to take towards architecting your technical solution for your requirements? And then finally, just talk a little bit about how do you do evaluation? Evaluation is incredibly important before you go into production. So let's jump in with use case definition. So this is a little bit of we covered this last time as well, but I want to kind of restate it as a starting point. When you look at use cases, they should always be seen in context of personas. And the persona needs to be somebody who has a very specific role and responsibility. And you should be able to point to someone in your organization and say, okay, Sally over there, or Jane, or whatever, that person meets this persona definition. It shouldn't be some abstract, vague, oh, I'm serving a business user. Business user is not a persona. The finance manager is a persona, procurement, the lead is a persona. Somebody who you can point to and identify who's being filled by a human being doing the job. Then for that particular persona, the next step is to really understand, what are the gaps that are in place relative to their current needs and the BI ecosystem that exists in your organization. So, what do they do today? How do they use their analytics today? What dashboards do they use? Where do they go? How do they answer questions today? What are the questions within the things among the universe of questions that they want to answer that they find hardest to answer? Sometimes dashboards oftentimes are fairly rigid and so there's certain questions, maybe why type questions, maybe second order type questions that they really find difficult to answer with dashboards, either because there's not a dashboard to answer it, or the answer is available, but it requires them to look across 3 or 4 or 5 different dashboards and reports, continuously switch filter values, combine all that information together and synthesize it for them. maybe there's some questions that are, of course, not answerable. There's just not covered by existing dashboards. Those are important to understand as a gap. And then also looking at just in general, in terms of analytics, in terms of interaction with BI, where are the places where they find them they're spending a whole lot of time, especially relative to the value that they're generating out of that analysis. And understanding these gaps will then point the finger towards like where is it that you should look for your AI for BI solutions, right? And then within those gaps, then you want to look and say, well, how do we have RO, what kind of ROI can we generate by filling those gaps? So when you look at ROI, you obviously want to tie wherever possible to revenue or cost benefits because that's what's understandable to everyone. But it's also important to understand that hard savings are significantly more valuable than soft savings. So what do I mean by that? If you look at something like time savings, you know, a soft savings around time would be to say, well, I'm going to implement this. It's going to make it easy, this AI for BI solution. It's going to make it easier for this particular community to ask questions. And that's going to save everyone, uh, you know, 2 hours a week or 5 hours a week or whatever it is, right? So that's a soft saving because how are they going to spend that time? What does that mean to the business? It's very unknowable. But for that same time situation, if you say, well, by doing this, I'm going to save 20% of time that's required of analyst time. And that means that instead of 10 analysts serving this particular user community, I'm only going to need 8, and 2 of them can be repurposed towards other activities. That's a hard savings, right? The cost of serving that particular community has been tangibly and measurably reduced by virtue of what was added. So focus on hard savings where you can. And then, very important, anyone can come up with assumptions. ROI and anyone can build a spreadsheet with ROI. It's critical that you validate any assumptions with a particular persona and with management, so that you know that the business is standing behind you and saying, yes, in fact, if we enable these capabilities, we're going to be able to generate this ROI, and it's going to be amazing. So let's look at some examples, right? Again, take it out of the theoretical and look at a few examples. So let's look at 3 personas. So imagine for a moment you've got Dana in a retail store environment. These are all on retail as an example. So Dana's a store manager. Yeah, and she's responsible for, she needs to be able to understand sales. She needs to compare to plan. Needs to look at shrink, staff scheduling, efficiencies, things of that nature. She may be looking at various types of questions that she wants to ask. Maybe she wants to know, hey, last weekend, I noticed sales were a little down. Why were they down compared to the prior weekend? Or maybe which product categories underperformed versus the regional average this month, right? Where is my store not doing as well as other stores in my region? Things like that, right? And that's what you'd want to be able to ask. And the gaps are that, if you look at what are the dashboards that are available for Dana, maybe she has a bunch of reports, they're static, and a bunch of dashboards that have a few filters, but that doesn't cover a lot of the questions that she asks, especially the why questions. And oftentimes she has to go to an analyst to answer those questions. And that will take 3 to 5 days to come back with a response because the analysts are quite busy in this organization. So given that, then for this particular use case, then the ROI might be, well, if she can answer these questions by herself, and she can get those answers without having to ask anyone and wait, then maybe there's a 1 to 2% in-store revenue recovery that she can that she says, hey, I can definitely do that if I had this information. And then maybe there's also, because she doesn't have to go to the analyst, we're not taking up a lot of time across all the personas that are doing this, maybe there's a 20 or 30% capacity reduction on the analyst team. And then you can take those folks, allocate them elsewhere, and take out the cost of supporting the stores from the analytical team. So that's kind of how it would work for this persona. Another example, if we look at this, maybe somebody like Marcus, somebody from supply chain. Right. So in this case, maybe this is somebody who's really doing the planning, making sure that things don't go out of stock. They're trying to figure out things like, hey, which stores are at risk of stocking my top SKUs, right? Or where does inventory, based on inventory velocity, it's happening right now, where are things deviating from forecast, where I might have out of stock coming up, right? And what might be the case is that for Marcus, he has a whole bunch of planning tools, but they don't really work proactively. They're reactive. They tell him when things are out of stock after they're already out of stock. He can't really anticipate. It's not doesn't adjust for trends that are happening. And if he had a way to ask questions and then and an intelligent agent could figure out for him where things might be going wrong, and more importantly, if that agent could even reach out to him and let him know in advance when things look like out of stock situations may be developing into the future, right? So he has the ability to anticipate and avoid them. Then there could be a whole bunch of revenue protection where people are where you're able to increase your sales because folks come in the store and they're able to buy the thing they want rather than finding it out of stock. Right. So that's an example there. And then the final example I give you is more of a maybe management type situation. Maybe the Sally, she's finance VP of operations. She's interested in things like, hey, I noticed my gross margin's dropping. Why is it dropping? What's contributing to it? Or which cost centers are trending above budget and what's contributing to that overage. And what's typically the case is that, she might have a whole bunch of things, dashboards, but they don't necessarily provide an easy answer to that. So there's a whole bunch of analysts that are supporting that function and answering questions and preparing all the analysis for management for executive presentations, etc. So maybe if you look at all the kinds of questions you could answer with your AI for BI system, you could identify a certain number of hours per month of finance team capacity that would be recaptured, which means that next year's growth can be accomplished without hiring another finance person. Or again, finance people can focus on some other projects that they couldn't otherwise do, and therefore there's some savings there. So that's just some examples, right? Obviously, your examples would be specific to your business, but it's good to see kind of how this kind of a template would be applied. And the key milestone, like what's the milestone before you exit the stage, is to be able to say, is there a verified ROI that is worth the effort involved? So it's going to be obviously cost, but not just software and licensing, etc. But you're going to be talking about labor and to be able to pull all this together. The cost there's a benefit generated. Is the juice worth a squeeze? And can you verify that the benefit is there by having the business vouch for it? So if you don't have this, then you haven't identified a persona and a set of use cases for which the effort will be worthwhile, and you should just continue working on this stage of the project before you move into planning and technology and implementation and all that. Because otherwise, you could do an outstanding job in your implementation, but you're effectively implementing something that's not that valuable. Okay, so assuming you've got those use cases defined and you've filled out that spreadsheet with the information I just showed you, and and it all looks really great, management signing off on that, then the next thing to look at is to say, well, what is my enterprise content landscape? What do I have in my enterprise that's going to support these particular use cases? And that falls into 4 different categories. You want to look at where are the data sources, obviously, where you're going to be bringing in this information. So data warehouses, data lakes, whatever you might have. You want to be able to understand what are the metrics and KPIs that each of these personas needs to have available out of these data sources in order to be able to perform the functions that we just described, right? And then you want to understand what external factors need to be understood and factored into this. So if somebody is looking at answering these kinds of questions, what are the things that are not in the data, that are going to be important to be able to really understand what's happening? Because a lot of times the answers are, especially the why questions, are not necessarily in the data. And finally, you want to understand, where does your business context live? So if you think about your AI for BI system as an analyst that you just onboarded onto your organization, what would be the things that you would have to give to that analyst for them to understand how your business operates, how things are calculated, what are the things that they need to know in order to accurately answer the questions that are being asked of them. Right? So looking at each of these areas and drilling down a little bit, let's imagine that scenario with Dana as a store manager, and let's look at what that might look like. Right. So for Dana, maybe obviously the POS transaction system or wherever that data goes is very important. She needs to know what her sales are on a very timely basis. There might be a labor scheduling platform that has data that needs to be incorporated into this if she's going to be doing planning on staffing and things of that nature. Store operations, shrink loss prevention reporting, all these things that currently maybe she has dashboards or reports. The underlying data behind that needs to be available to the agent to work with. So you can see how you can inventory that and have a pretty good idea of, okay, with this data, we can actually cover the use cases that we talked about. Then out of that data, you can verify and say, do we have all the metrics that she cares about? Again, these are the things that if you ask this persona, they'll be able to rattle these metrics off the tip of their tongue because they use it every day in running their business. So, sales, planning, growth, labor cost, shrink rate, whatever is relevant to that persona in this case, validate are those things in the trusted data source. Next is, what kind of external factors are going to matter here? So if you think about this you're looking at a store manager perspective, you're going to have things like, local events. Maybe there was a promotion to drive people into that particular store. Weather conditions. If you're selling coats and there's a particularly cold month, that might affect sales positively. Similarly, if you're if you're a regular retail outfit and there's a huge storm period happening during a period of time, that could negatively affect sales. So understanding weather events, looking at regional competitor activity, right? If your competitor opened up a store next door from you last month, well, that might affect your sales this month, right? You're now sharing wallet share in terms of people walking by. Holiday calendars, obviously, right? There's a seasonality associated with that. So all of these factors need to be are important in answering the kinds of questions that this type of user might ask, right? And then finally, the business context, right? So here you're going to have business context that is sort of this tribal knowledge. People know about things. If they know about it, is it documented somewhere? Can it be found? Is it just sending in emails and memos somewhere, or really hard to access? Or are there operating procedures, playbooks, and SharePoint, maybe documents on a shared drive? What are all the things that are really needed that a human analyst would need to be able to answer the kinds of questions that Dana has asked, right? So you get a sense of your entire landscape in detail, and then really your milestone or your validation step is you ask the question. Is there enough information based on the entire information context there to answer most of the user's questions that I need? And it has to be the vast majority of questions that you need to answer in order to generate the value for the use case, right? And if you don't, if the reality is that, well, we need to have this weather data because a lot of times weather has a real impact, but I don't have that right now, then before you proceed in building your agent that the user works with, you need to build the agent that goes and collects the weather information and stores it someplace and makes it accessible for your AI for BI system. So this will guide you as to whether you're ready to go through this gate or not. So assuming you've gone through both of those gates, you now have all your requirements defined. You've got a general sort of understanding of the information landscape, and it looks like it's going to satisfy the needs of your use case. Now you're ready to look at your architecture and you look at and architect an actual solution, right? And here you want to start with thinking about the agentic layer, right? So you look to see, is there already an agentic layer that you can tap into on top of the data? Maybe you're working in the Fabric ecosystem. Well, maybe the Fabric data agents are available there. If you've got Snowflakes, you've got the Cortex ecosystem. If you're on Databricks, you've got Genie, right? So look and see what's already available, so that you don't rebuild something from scratch for where the capability to turn something on is much faster based on what's there. Second thing is you look at, well, okay, what existing semantic models can you leverage? So this is mapping back to the content information. Maybe there's already a definition for planning models for out of stock or semantic models that explain specific areas around store sales. So what can already be built on top of there? And then finally, is this underlying infrastructure, the agentic layer that might already be there, the semantic model that's there, or if you can build an agentic layer, which you have, will this support the RLS and single sign-on requirements that your users are going to need to be successful? Right? So this is kind of a checklist there. And so to look at an example, Let's imagine that we're building a BI agent here that's gonna service those sort of store questions that get asked. You've got now your data. So let's imagine that maybe the data resides in Fabric. So you've got a Fabric lakehouse, and you built a semantic model on top of that, and then you're building a Fabric data agent on top of that. So your questions are related to the data are going to be serviced by your Fabric agent. Then you've got the metadata, so your agent's going to need to, the BI agent is going to need to have access to your context metadata. So that might come from, maybe you have Calibra data catalog, where a lot of the formulas and calculations for how we things are computed are there. So we're gonna, maybe do a metadata sync to land that into context metadata that's going to be relevant for all the definitions coming to the BI agent. So when a user asks a question and they use an abbreviation or they refer to terminology, the ABI agent can map that to something that it can pass to the semantic model that the Fabric data agent is working with to answer the question properly, as an example. And then external factors. You might realize, well, I've got to do, maybe I have another agent that I need to create that I'm going to use that every day is going to do a web search, and it's going to identify, any relevant weather activity that's happening for the locations where I have stores, and it's going to log those weather events into a database table so that these external factors are available. It's going to look at activity of my competitors, activity of my suppliers, look at event information. So there's probably in this kind of a use case, there's going to probably be a separate process that goes and mines these externalities and lands them someplace so that when the BI agent has a question, it doesn't have to go from ground zero and surf the web and find and look everywhere in your organization to find what context. It already has a context repository that's relevant to the particular subject area that it's covering. So with that, you can see if you had an agent you put in place, it's orchestrating, it can orchestrate, it can bring in it takes the user question, it can supplement it with context, it can ask the question of the data agent, it can then get those results, it can look at external factors that may apply and integrate that in and then present a coherent view to the user. So the key milestone here is whatever it is that you've decided to implement, does that architecture support the use cases? And again, we talked about that more last time, so I'm not going to belabor this, but you want to look at both push and pull modalities. You want to make sure that everything that your users are expecting from a user experience perspective, that those things are going to be present in the solution that you've implemented. Okay, so with that, then the next thing, and this is incredibly important, and unfortunately, many times people make the mistake of forgetting or giving short thrift to this. So I want to really focus on this. Is you want to look at evaluation, right? What's your because an evaluation is not just with something you do after you roll out, where you ask your users, is it useful? It's something you need to do before you deploy to validate and ensure that you have a high quality solution that in fact will answer the questions that your users expect to get answered. Right. So I'm going to talk about, three different approaches that are used to create evaluation baselines that you can run and assess against your model, with your agent, and sort of some of the attributes of these, and they're the things that are more common across the different ecosystems. So if we go that we're going to talk about metadata driven, generating synthetic evals based from metadata. We're going to talk about, using logs to harvest what people are already asking and be able to, map that into starting up eval criteria. And then the more programmatic seed and expand type of approach that's common in the Fabric ecosystem. Right. So essentially, what's most common in the Databricks ecosystem, what's most common in Snowflake, and then what's most common in Fabric. So if you've got Databricks, then you're probably going to look at generating, in addition to taking anything that your users have given you, and that's important in all these cases. The fundamental assumption is that you've done some interviewing of users, you understand based on those use cases, what are the typical questions that they're likely to ask. And therefore you have the ability to start with you've added those data sets. But in addition to that, to get really good coverage, you can use a facility in Databricks to take the schema, so the information that you have in your Unity catalog, and generate a whole bunch of questions based on that. So it creates this sort of automated ground truth generation of questions and then the corresponding SQL that would be associated with it that would be answered based on those tables. And you can dial it up so you have some diversity in your SQL. There can be complexity, lots of joins across the tables, across different tables, and it gives you sort of this coverage. So you might start with initially having a few dozen questions that your users have given you, and this could expand into several hundred, right? Because now you're looking across, you're auto-generating a lot of different questions. So this is a really great way to bootstrap a cold start. Having a lot, you don't have very much, but you can start up with a bunch of queries that you can use as a baseline, and then you review those, of course, to make sure that what's correct and what's not, and then you set them into a sort of a verified state for it to be used in testing and baselining your system. If you're in the Snowflake ecosystem, you're probably more likely to use like a log-based harvesting approach. So here, the idea is that you're going to go through the query logs and you're going to pull out what are the eval questions what are the most commonly run SQL there, and then potentially build eval questions backwards from there. Now, of course, when you do that, you need to filter for is this Genie? Not, I meant Genie. Should say Cortex relevant queries, right? So you're not going to do you're not going to be looking at things that don't apply to your database at all, right? And it was like not apply to your users at all. So, for example, you might have data transformation queries. You might think of things running by BI tools to populate extracts. Those all have to go out, and you're just going to be looking at AI relevant queries for this agent relevant queries. Then you're going to be going through and score and prioritize those query candidates, and those are things that run more frequent, that are asked more frequently, obviously, are more important. The things that return smaller data sets are more useful. Like, if something is the query is returning a million rows, that's probably not something a user is going to be likely to ask an AI agent for help with. So you can do that, and then you go through that, and as an analyst, you mark which are the verified queries, and based on the verified queries, that becomes your golden master set of things that you evaluate. So, in the first case, we were going to the metadata and generate questions based on that. Here, you're going to the logs and pulling SQL that gets used in going from that to generating questions there. And you could use some of these capabilities across ecosystems. So it's not limited to just Fabric in this case. And then the third scenario is more of a programmatic approach. This is what you might use in the Fabric ecosystem. So here you are looking at notebook. Here you write some Python. You use you create you take a set of DAX. Maybe you harvest a set of DAX queries from your logs. You identify, you can set them up in a Python workbook. You can then create this whole verified answer capability. So once you verify that a particular DAX statement off a semantic model is correctly answering something, you can put it into a verified set, and then that verified answer will always be used. So Fabric will, when that question gets asked, instead of it thinking and reinventing the DAX statement on the fly, it will go to that verified query and use that instead. There's also another technique, which is you can go for any kind of failed test cases. You can go back and add few-shot learning, which is additional context that the model that the agent receives, and that's unlike the verified answers, which apply to a very specific query. This will more generically apply. It'll teach the model, hey, here's how we generally want to join things together when we're looking at these kinds of questions, right? So those few-shot examples can be generalized, and again and then there's also the prep for AI workflow within Fabric. It's quite useful where you're basically posting information directly to the semantic model that then can be used by the AI to inform and improve the quality of what's there. So it just in all three of these examples, it's an iterative use case scenario. You're building up a data set, you're running it, you're validating the things that don't work, you're going back, you're defining and improving the semantic layer, you're adding information, creating all these concepts. The concept of verified type queries exists in one way or another across all these ecosystems. And through that, you're really getting coverage across those critical use cases so that you have a high level of confidence that for the most common, for the most important questions, your agent is going to respond in high quality because you've checked that before you've released it into the wild for people to use. So the key milestone here is asking the question, do you have an evaluation set that lines up well with user expectation? In other words, does it have the breadth that the user expectations would be needed, and does it have the variability within it, that it's not just this brittle, I've only got 10 questions and the representative, but if I ask these questions in some slightly different ways, I'm not going to get the right answers, right? So making sure you've got both depth and breadth across your validation set, and that it maps very well to your use cases that you defined at the beginning. And remember that, one very simple way to get the user questions that you ask is to look at what have people asked in the past. It doesn't have to be complicated. In addition to this synthetic and programmatic generation, just simply going back and to the analysts that are serving users and saying, well, what kind of questions do you get from these users, or asking the users what kind of questions have you had to ask analysts, and inventorying those is a really good starting point, in addition to all of these generated solutions that give you more breadth and depth across the ecosystem. Okay, so kind of to just summarize then what we've talked about, we've talked about the fact that the first thing you do is you understand and document your use cases. Do not pass go until you've done that. Then with those use cases in hand, you go and you validate that for each particular use case, you can generate the ROI because you have access to the right content in your enterprise, both at the context level and at the data level, and looking at external events where it's applicable. And all that can be wrapped together into your architecture as a next step. So you validate that, yes, now I have an architecture that can combine all of these critical data sources in a way that will support the use cases, right? So you can just see how this all builds on top of each other. And then you evaluate and validate that through a benchmark that you establish internally. You do validation that you run before you release, and then as you make changes to the system, as you add capabilities, change prompting, do all that stuff, you continue to run that as A/B testing to make sure that it is quality is not degrading as time goes by. And those are the keys. And then, I want to, before we go into Q&A, I want to remind everyone the final webinar is going to be really all about putting this in practice. So we're going to show you how, some examples of user experiences where the AI sits right next to the BI, which are KPI driven. They incorporate push capabilities, and really break down and show you how all these pieces can be put together into solutions that really work in your ecosystem, that delight your users and leverage your existing BI platform. So definitely, put on your calendar on the 28th and join us for that webinar as well. So with Mike, Mike, I guess that's it for the
Yep.
presentation. Let's talk about any questions that we have.
Yeah, let's look here. There's a couple come into the Q&A window if you've got that, Marius.
Let me
So
look in there.
reading those.
Okay.
Let me pick some here. So, can you expand a bit more on the evaluation criteria and making sure it's comprehensive enough? Maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So you mean I guess the evaluation criteria. Um,
How do you make sure your criteria is comprehensive enough to
yes.
support
to
the things
support
you
to
were just
support
talking about?
the use what I was talking right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that the best way to do that, I think is first of all you stress test it against the users that gave you that criteria, right? You make sure that you've gathered a lot of user definitions for that. Then you kind of do that second pass about looking at all the different variability that there can be in questions and how they're getting asked. And then the third part of it is looking at all of the things that users have not asked that have asked analysts. So getting analyst feedback on things that need to be included, making sure that's in the eval set. And then finally, I think it's really looking at things that the agent shouldn't be able to answer, right? And making sure that you're getting reasonable answers for that as well. In other words, you're not getting hallucinations or made up answers or things like that. So looking at things that, when you went through the initial process, you probably identified that, hey, I can handle, I've gotten 10 questions here. I know that these 8 I can handle. These last 2 I'm not going to be able to handle because the context isn't available anywhere. right? Or or I don't have the data for it, or whatever the condition might be. Well, it's actually, you probably want to include those in the eval checklist anyway, because you want to make sure that the response that the agent provides is coherent and it tells the user that they cannot answer it and it doesn't just make something up, right? And so that everything is sort of grounded properly. So I'd say that all those factors, if you can combine them all, then you have a pretty good, and then use these tools that are available to automate to kind of again create more depth around your eval set, so you have hundreds of use cases eval conditions, not just a few dozen. Then I think you're in pretty good shape.
Okay, why can't the context metadata be built within the Fabric latehouse if all the data is persisted there?
So it just sometimes doesn't exist there. So you should 100% without a question leverage all the context you have in the Fabric Lakehouse, right? So, and if you've got, again, if you're using, if you've got a unique catalog or whatever you have, some organizations have context that sits in Calibra or it sits in Alation or Atlan, data catalog, or there's a bunch of things that are in Google Sheets or a SharePoint drive that has this thing. A lot of times it's just the reality that in the messy environments, especially things where people were not thinking about how they were going to build AI agents, they were just capturing context wherever, however they want to, however made sense at the time. This is not necessarily in your. It's not the metadata is not all in the lake house. And now, of course, you can look at saying, well, maybe I can take all of the metadata that I have and then somehow have a process that pushes it into the lakehouse. And then if you do that, then, if it makes sense to do that, then perhaps that would work. But there's some scenarios where you have to reason across it and it doesn't. So it's a really case by case basis. But I would agree in general with the principle that whatever you can make available directly to the agent, right, so that you don't need to supplement, you know, the better. Right. So that's definitely that would definitely be the case. But there are some situations where the context where user is asking a question are just you can't put it into warehouse. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're going to ask you need users to be able to use a dashboard and you want to be able to ask question about the thing that they're looking at in the dashboard, right? They're looking at a dashboard, they have a question, you open up a little we'll show you an example of this next time, but you open up a little slider and then you say, okay, you chat with your agent, you ask a question. Well, if if you some of the context associated with the question that's being asked is actually in the dashboard relative to what they were filtering on. So that context has to be added to the question that's being asked of the agent, because if it isn't, then the agent won't understand. You've filtered your data on a particular country or a particular store, and you've asked a question about that store, and then the agent just sees the question. It's not going to understand. So it is true that you want to put as much as you can into your agentic layer that does at the data layer, but it's simply sometimes not possible to do everything.
Okay, maybe time for one more here. We have a lot of tool options internally in
Mhm.
Snowflake and Microsoft particularly. How do we decide which ones to use and where to start?
Yeah, so I think that's a big question. And so first of all, I would encourage you, if you haven't watched our the series that talks about the landscape in general and some of the pros and cons and capabilities of tools, go watch that particular item, that second one of of this particular series. It's on YouTube. But in general, to answer your question, like let's imagine you've got a whole bunch of capabilities already. What do you do about how do you pick it? I think a good rule of thumb is start with the things that are closest to where your context and your data live, right? So, and have the richest access to context and data. So, for example, if you in your let's I don't know what your situation is, but let's imagine you have Snowflake and you've got Power BI and you've got a semantic model on top of Snowflake, right? So, in that situation, the semantic model probably has a lot more context than Snowflake itself. So yes, you could try Snowflake Cortex, or you could try Fabric agent. I would start with in this case, everything all being equal with the thing with Fabric to see if that will meet your capabilities. Simply because there you have the benefit of the semantic model, whereas you might not have that in the Snowflake example. And there can be other situations where you might do something different, but the process that's important there is looking at where does the business context live to be able to answer the question. Is there an existing agentic system you can enable quickly with minimal effort that can cover that has access to that context? If yes, then see if you can get value out of that before you move into other solutions elsewhere, and orchestration and more complex solutions. Um, and also the other thing I would say around tools in general is that the agentic layer for these tools is rapidly improving because of the fact that the agents, the LLMs themselves are improving. So they're stacked on top of frontier models, and those models are getting better. So there's a lot of times where the things that might not have worked like a few months ago are going to work for you now, so it's worth rechecking. And then final point here, if you do need to provide a lot of external context, it's helpful to understand any context limits that are available. So, for example, even in the example we just spoke about, let's imagine you were looking at fabric data agents as a possibility. You want to look at that. Well, if you need to provide that fabric data agent dynamically a whole bunch of other contexts, you got to pull definitions out of your Calibra system and other things, and business terms, abbreviations that it doesn't know about, and at runtime give it to the system. Then that might be problematic because currently the fabric data agents only allow 15,000 characters, right? So if you've got more than that amount, then that architecture won't work for you. So there are different considerations to look at, but start with what's closest to your semantic data model and your data, and then see does that work for you. If there's reasons that doesn't work, then look at the other tooling and see if you can put something together that orchestrates and works well.
Right, well, with that, we're going to wrap up here. Thanks everyone for joining today. As Marius said, encourage you to join us again in a couple of weeks on the 26th, where we're going to demo some stuff around these concepts that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. We're also on the road at conferences over the next couple of weeks. So if anyone is at the Gartner conference or the Fabric conference, feel free to stop by our booth and say hello. Otherwise, we'll talk to you on the 26th of March. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone. Thanks,
everyone.
Marius.
Take care.